Trying to find.
Oh, here we go.
Good evening to everyone who's coming in and joining us. We'll give everyone just a couple more seconds to come from the waiting room.
I didn't comb my hair. I didn't know we were going to be on video.
I know that feeling.
Oh, well, and it is a choice. We'll talk about the options of Zoom in a little bit, but it is a choice. So if you do want to go ahead and turn off your video, feel free. If not, we're happy to see your lovely face.
No problem.
Did it turn on?
No, let it get time. Might not have enough.
As everyone's coming in, just some housekeeping reminders. If you want to mute yourself, unless you plan to raise your hand or speak. We are going to be recording as well. So if you don't want your face to get recorded along with everyone else's, you can stop your video as well. Start video is next. All right, well, I think, should we go ahead and get started? It's 7:02. My name is Andrea Malcolm. Welcome everyone to 2021 and our first Empowered by Place. I'm Andrea Malcolm, Molly Brown House Museum Director, and my partner tonight is Allison Salutes, Director of Community Programs. For those of you who are members who have attended an event before, we're combining two community conversation programs together, our Salon series and our Regarding Denver. We're putting them into one series of events with the hope that will spark conversations around social justice issues, advocacy, and community-wide issues. So Empowered by Place really is a conversation about how Denver's historic places play an important role in our present. So we're using current headlines, but also great historic places. And together we hope to unpack some of today's pressing issues. So again, we ask that you keep yourself muted to lessen background noise unless you would like to speak, and then make use of the raise your hand or chat box. We've also already placed some links in the chat box to some of the things we'll be referencing in tonight's talk. And then we will send a follow-up email with additional links that we'll talk about this evening. So as some of you may know, if you're already a member of Historic Denver, it's our 50th anniversary this year. And as a preservation organization founded to save the Molly Brown House Museum, you can see it behind me, the past 50 years have been spent telling the story of Denver through our Margaret Molly Brown, then being a partner in preserving many other places that tell the unique story of the Denverites who came before us. So as we look forward to another 50 years, we're launching our 50 Actions for 50 Places campaign, and we want you to be a part of this grassroots effort, just like people were 50 years ago to save the Molly Brown House Museum. So we're looking to you, our community, to help identify the places, spaces, and people that should be preserved and their stories told. So if you're not already, please sign up for our newsletters, become a member, and stay tuned for information on how you can take part in the actions to help us discover those 50 places or the stories of these people. I'm going to turn it over to Allison now, who's going to tell us about our program this evening.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrea. And thank you guys so much for being here. We were thrilled to kind of put this out into the world and find that a lot of people were interested in the topic and wanted to join us this evening. So thank you all so much. If you want to go ahead and find that chat window and maybe just like tell us what compelled you to join this program tonight, that'll kind of help us as we think about future programs that we're putting together and all those kind of things. So feel free to use the chat box to just share a little bit with us. And then really just to kick things off here tonight, Andrea mentioned that Historic Denver was founded 50 years ago to save the Molly Brown House, and that's a really big piece of our story. But the other one is we've been involved for 50 years in saving places that matter to Denver. And I think tonight is a really great example. I think many of us have fond memories of the Brown Palace and really think of it as one of those kind of key historic places in the city of Denver. And it's really part of the reason that it is here today is because it's part of our downtown historic district. And so that offers it a level of protection that kind of allows us to rest easy at night, knowing that exterior will remain the same. And then in conversations that we were having with tonight's speaker, we're really captivated by some of the stories that she was sharing that were maybe your less like top Wikipedia entry information. She was sharing with us so many details about additional parts of the Brown history. And one piece that really stood out was just that during the Great Depression, the Brown Palace actually made a pretty big pivot to offer housing in a different type of way. And so Andrea and I really felt this immediate connection to some of what we're seeing today, you know, especially in terms of it's an unprecedented time for hotels. We're watching historic hotels transform. And so we really felt like that was a really nice piece that we could bring together the past and the present. So with that kind of explanation of our evening tonight, we're going to start with the history piece, and then we're going to talk about how we see that connecting to the present. And so I'm very pleased and honored that historian Debra Faulkner is here with us tonight. She is the author of 7 books about Colorado history, including, and I think most relevant to this evening, Ladies of the Brown, A Women's History of Denver's Most Elegant Hotel. She is from Colorado. She grew up in Loveland, and she's been a professor at Metro State and been the resident historian at the Brown Palace for the past 12 years. So I'm going to give her a minute as I kind of introduce her to get her PowerPoint up for us. And she is going to—
see my screen?
Yes, okay. She's going to dazzle us with some of her information this evening.
And it is. I think I'm going to get it. Slideshow. Let's see if this will do it. Is that slideshow? Yeah. Nope, that's video. Sorry, hold on.
No, you're good. We can see your screen.
Okay, there's slideshow.
Yeah. Perfect.
And shouldn't there be something that says from the beginning? There we go.
Yeah, there it is. Perfect.
Ta-da-da-da. All right, shall I go ahead and begin?
Please feel free, yes.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for taking the time to join this virtual event this evening. And I really thank Andrea and Allison for inviting me to take part in this. I was telling them I've been furloughed from my job since the middle of March. And I was really, really happy to get something to apply my brain to. It's getting a little rusty here after 10+ months. So this has been really fun for me to do. Ever since it opened, 1892, the history of the Brown Palace has been integral to the history of Denver and the history of Colorado. And before the COVID-19 hit the fan in 2020, it was distinguished from every other hotel in downtown Denver by almost 128 years of continuous elegance and excellence. They had never closed once from the day they opened in 1892. But circumstances being what they were, the hotel did have to close for the first time in its history. Last year from April through June, it was actually 64 days total. They are reopened and they are gradually trying to come back just like the rest of us are. Let's go ahead here. Let's see if I can do this. Hooray. All right. So the Oxford Hotel is the oldest hotel in Denver that still operates as a hotel. They're actually 1 year older than the Brown Palace. They certainly were not the first hotel in Denver. That honor probably goes to the El Dorado Hotel, which was opened way back 1859, early days of the Gold Rush by the Count and Countess Katrina and Henri Murat. It was basically at Lawrence and 10th, right on Cherry Creek, and pretty much wiped out by the flood of 1864. But the fun story about the El Dorado is they erected a 60-foot flagpole, and to welcome the first stagecoach to come into Denver in May of '59, the Countess made a flag to fly from that pole. And because there were no yard goods available in the baby city of Denver in those early days, the legend is that she made that flag from her French undergarments. And in a city that was, you know, what, 95% young bachelors, probably not surprising that flag was stolen after a couple of days. And Lord knows what things were perpetrated upon it, but it was returned eventually. So Count and Countess Murat, the El Dorado Hotel was the very first, but the Oxford is the oldest hotel in Denver that still operates as a hotel, 1891. It's at 17th and Wazee, right around Union Station, and that's where all the hotels were in the early days, because of course that's how everybody arrived in the city. By the late 1880s, early 1890s, 100 trains a day were going in and out of Union Station, and the city was booming. So a lot of hotels were springing up in that neighborhood along with the Oxford. The Oxford, by the way, really did kind of start to turn into Skid Row in the post-war years, 50s, 60s, 70s, and it actually had to be closed late 80s, early 90s to be brought back up to snuff, but it is a wonderful historic hotel today. Couple of other grand hotels from that same period. Probably the finest hotel in Denver was the Windsor Hotel here on the left. It was at 19th and Larimer. Victim of urban renewal, of course. This hotel was where Horace, Silver King Horace Tabor, kept his mistress at the time, Baby Doe, before they were married. Although it was demolished, a lot of the things from the Windsor have been preserved at the Teller House in Central City. Some of you may have seen, they've got the old gold diamond dust mirrors from the Windsor and some of the furnishings from Baby Doe's suite. The Metropole Hotel here on the other side kind of broke the mold by building on Broadway at Tremont and Broadway. And the reason for this kind of relocation away from Union Station was that the Capitol building was rising just a few blocks away. And they knew they were going to need some fine hotels in that neighborhood. The Capitol was rising on 10 acres donated by Henry Cordis Brown. It was right in the middle of his 160 acres of homestead property. And when Henry bought this property, he dreamed of developing it, and he optimistically laid out street grids and lots, and people in Denver called it Brown's Folly. It was about a mile southeast of where Denver was growing up around Larimer Square, and people said the city will never, ever spread that far out. But Henry was nobody's fool. He knew in donating that land, and as the Capitol rose, that the demand for his lots in that neighborhood would go through the roof. They did, and they made him a very wealthy man with the Capitol Hill development. So Henry decided to use that money to build the absolute grandest hotel in Denver. He used to say he built it for his beloved wife, Jane. I think he actually built it for his own legacy. And on the other side of this slide, you see a carving of Henry Brown that used to, well, it's still there, by the original grand entrance to the hotel on the Broadway side of the building. The Brown Palace took 4 years to build and a total of $2 million way back in 1892 because it was nothing but the finest. It was considered at the time one of the 3 premier hotels in the country, right up there with the original Waldorf in New York City and the Auditorium Hotel in Chicago, which no longer exists. This slide shows the original grand entrance on the Broadway side of the building, which is on the right hand of the slide. It's got a little bit of a elevated thing in the center there. That grand entrance had to be closed in the 1930s because of heavy traffic on Broadway. It just made it too difficult to load and unload hotel guests on that side. This old postcard is Broadway, and it shows the Brown Palace and its relative position there to Trinity Methodist Church. The Metropole that I mentioned earlier, you see, was right across Broadway. And in just a few years' time, other hotels sprouted up. The Albany, the Shirley Savoy, later the Cosmopolitan Hotel, which I actually remember going to as a child. And the Metropole kind of fronted the Broadway Theater. So this was quite the happening part of town. The Brown Palace was situated on a perfect right triangle shaped lot at Broadway, Tremont, and 17th. And this happened because of the intersection of two different early street grids in Denver that were differently aligned. The original street grid down around Larimer Square, all the streets were parallel and perpendicular to Cherry Creek. When Henry Brown laid out the streets and lots in his future Capitol Hill development, he just followed the compass points north, south, east, west. And where those two different street grids finally intersect in this part of town, you'll notice a lot of those odd triangle-shaped blocks and the crazy angled streets that make everybody crazy. The original managers of the Brown Palace, the one on the left, William Billy Bush. This man was a very experienced, very successful hotelier in Colorado by the time the Brown Palace opened. He had already owned and operated the Teller House in Central City, the Clarendon Hotel in Leadville. He was the owner and manager of the Windsor Hotel and the owner and manager of the Metropole Hotel. And this brings to mind a legend that I often have to debunk as a historian of the Brown Palace. People will say to me, I heard that Henry Brown once went into the Windsor Hotel in his cowboy gear, looking a little bit grubby, and they refused to rent him a room. And he vowed then and there to build an even grander hotel to drive them out of business. Everybody loves a good revenge story, but this legend doesn't hold water on so many levels. For one thing, Henry Brown was many things. Cowboy was never one of them. And he was obviously very good friends and business partners with William Bush, or he wouldn't have made him one of the co-managers of the Brown Palace. The other co-manager was Nathaniel Maxey Tabor. He was the son of Horace and his first wife, Augusta. And ironically, William Billy Bush here was the man who introduced Horace to Baby Doe, the homewrecker's second wife. So kind of an interesting little bit of history behind the scenes there. There was no expense spared with the Brown Palace. It was nothing but the best. Chicago architect Frank E. Edbrook, who was the second architect on the State Capitol building. He was actually brought to Denver by Horace Tabor to build his Tabor Grand Opera House that used to stand at 16th and Curtis, where that horrible Federal Reserve Bank building is now. He designed the outside in Richardsonian Romanesque style, with the first floor being out of Colorado granite, the rest Arizona red sandstone. And then the interior he did in the Italian Renaissance style. And of course, the most striking feature of the hotel is this soaring 8-story atrium lobby in that style. Italian Renaissance includes things like the Florentine arches on the mezzanine level, all the natural stone, all the golden onyx from Torreon, Old Mexico, the filigreed panels on all the open balconies around those first 7 floors, and of course, a beautiful stained glass skylight. This was just stunning and unprecedented at the time. It became known as daylighting the interior space. From the beginning, this hotel is going to attract the wealthy, the elite. It started out with 318 guest rooms that went from $3 a night to the very dizzying $5 a night hotel rooms. Every one of them, because of the building's unique shape and design, was an exterior room. And it was customary when you checked in at the front desk for them to ask if you preferred morning sun in your room or afternoon sun. And based on that, they would decide where to assign you. Every suite of rooms had hot and cold running water and flush toilets. And all of the rooms had interior doorways that allowed you to connect however many rooms you wanted to create a little mini suite or a little mini apartment. And so even in the early years, a lot of people actually lived long-term in the Brown Palace in some of these apartments they created by combining several rooms. Among them was Colorado Governor William H. Adams. Let's see. The very prominent businessman rancher John Springer and his wife stayed long-term at the Brown oftentimes, even though they lived nearby. Augusta Tabor lived in the hotel for almost 2 years with Maxey and his family. She never liked the mansion that Horace bought her, which, by the way, was Henry Brown's family home right across Broadway from the Brown Palace. Oh gosh, African explorer, not, what was Groucho Marx's name? This guy was Paul Hoefler. And his family lived in the Brown Palace while he was off on his African adventures. As I say from the beginning, this place attracted presidents, royalty, celebrities, the social and the political elite. The very first president to stay at the Brown Palace was here on the list. This is Woodrow Wilson. He was there in 1919, actually the day before he had his stroke. And the first president to visit the Brown Palace was Teddy Roosevelt here in 1905. Other celebrities that the Brown Palace has hosted over the decades. When the Beatles visited in August of 1964, it was pandemonium. They think that 5,000 to 6,000 screaming teenagers encircled the block, and they had to convert the atrium lobby into a first aid station for all the young women who fainted or got trampled. They were smuggled in an employee entrance and up an employee elevator straight to their suite on the 8th floor. They never even saw the most beautiful part of the hotel, the atrium lobby. Over here, kind of clockwise, starting the top left, you've got Buffalo Bill Cody. He didn't really stay at the hotel because he had a sister who lived in Denver. He actually died at her house, but apparently he was a very frequent guest of the bar at the Brown Palace. Down below him is Thomas Edison, who did stay at the Brown Palace with his family. Hillary Clinton was there in 2008 for the Democratic National Convention. Oprah Winfrey, George Clooney, and the lady up above Hillary, you probably would not recognize her name. This is Evelyn Walsh McLean, but you would definitely recognize the name of the gem in her tiara. That's the Hope Diamond. She was the last private owner of the Hope Diamond. So just a sampling. But one of our favorite guests, of course, is Mrs. Brown, Margaret Tobin Brown. No relation at all to Henry Cordes Brown. It's a pretty common last name, but she was a frequent guest and often a long-term guest, especially in her later years after she separated from JJ. I believe that was 1909. I'm sure some of you know that better than I do. But at that point, she did a lot of traveling and he spent a lot of time in the Southwest. And so during those years, their house on Pennsylvania was usually rented out. And whenever she did return to Denver, she always stayed at the Brown Palace. This includes 2 weeks after the Titanic disaster. She checked into Suite 625 and she held press conferences about the disaster while she was staying at the hotel. Other occasions, she often held fundraisers at the Brown Palace for a couple of her favorite charities, the Humane Society and of course Catholic charities. One year in the early 1900s, she and Benjamin Guggenheim threw a big holiday party for the Denver urchins, as they called them, really basically homeless children, where they had a big turkey dinner and every single child got a Christmas gift. I always say Mrs. Brown definitely had, in her own words, a heart as big as a ham. Another Christmas, she had been staying at the hotel for quite a while, several weeks, I'm sure, and she decided to put a little Christmas tree at the front desk. And just a couple of days before the holiday, she personally handed out small gifts to every bellman, every doorman, every housekeeper, every waitstaff person. So just generous to a fault. And I think my favorite story comes from the managing director in the 1920s, who remembered one time when she stayed there for an extended period, she took voice lessons. And he recalled that soon after the arrival of her voice teacher at 10 o'clock every morning, you could hear the caterwauling, this is his quote, up and down the 8-story atrium. So a favorite guest of the Brown Palace. Uncompromising standards for the staff of the Brown Palace, because the clientele were the people who expected the best. These are restaurant and banquet servers, absolutely dressed to the nines. Now, one thing you will not notice in this picture is the face of any person of color. The Brown Palace for decades made it known that they were quote unquote not friendly to coloreds, and that applied not only to staff but also to guests. Immigrants, on the other hand, were employed all over the place in the hotel. Most immigrants who came to Denver found an immediate welcome at the Emily Griffith Opportunity School, where they could go to learn English and to study citizenship, to become citizens, but also they could learn a trade. There was a lot of vocational training, and the Brown Palace and other hotels in downtown Denver employed lots of Opportunity School graduates in the kitchens, in housekeeping, in laundry, maintenance engineers, accountants, stenographers, even floral designers. From the 1920s through the 1970s, 3 generations of the Betcher family owned the hotel. At the top, Charles Betcher, the senior, came over as a young German immigrant, made his first million selling hardware in Leadville during the silver boom. And he's one of these smart people who didn't put all his money in mining. He diversified all over the place into meat packing and railroads and sugar beets and concrete and everything. And he passed his fortune along to his son here in the middle. This is Claude, who went by the initial C.K. Betcher. And C.K. piloted the Brown Palace through the 30s, 40s, 50s. And then finally, his son, Charles II, there at the bottom, actually sort of oversaw the hotel as the head of the Betcher Foundation. Many of the alterations and additions that the Betchers, particularly CK, made to the hotel are still in evidence. So as Allison, I think, mentioned just briefly, in order to survive the Great Depression, C.K. Betcher decided to convert the top 2 floors of the hotel, floors 8 and 9, into private residential apartments. They were called the Skyline Apartments, a very prestigious, very pricey address. But the steady income from these permanent residents allowed the hotel part to continue operating without sacrificing any elegance or excellence throughout the Great Depression, World War II, and beyond. Until very recently, those top 2 floors retained a lot of those Art Deco touches. You see off to the right side, glass brick that enclosed the open atrium lobby for privacy and for quiet for the residents. The people who lived in the Skyline Apartments were very wealthy, high society people. A couple of the most long-term residents, one of them was Eleanor Blackmer. Her husband, Myron Blackmer, was an oil tycoon who got kind of tied up in the Teapot Dome scandal. She lived there for 31 years. And then I think the guy who holds the record is Mr. Kenneth Townsend. He was basically just a trust fund dilettante. He was proud to brag that he had only worked one day in his whole life, and that was for Betcher and Company. And he would just walk up every day to the University Club and hang out with his friends. And he lived there for 41 years, and I think he was pretty savvy, because apparently when he moved in the 30s, somehow he made an agreement with the Betchers to lock in his rental rate. So when he died in the late 1970s, he was still only paying like $80 a month for his rental in the Skyline Apartments. Several Betchers themselves lived in the Skyline Apartments. Charles Betcher Sr. Lived there and actually died in bed in his apartment at the Brown Palace. After that, Charles II lived there, and when he passed away, his second wife, May, lived there for several years. The lady you see here coming out of the doors of the Brown Palace, this is Mrs. Crawford Hill, Louise Hill, the queen of Denver High Society around the turn of last century. I know you're all familiar with the story of Margaret Brown, and this is the high society lady who snubbed her as new money, too rough around the edges, not quite good enough for the sacred 36. But with the Great Depression, a lot of wealthy people like Mrs. Hill discovered that their big mansions, you see her mansion here down below, were really too expensive to keep up. They just couldn't afford to do it anymore. So they downsized and moved in, a lot of them, into these apartments of the Brown Palace. Louise Hill lived in apartment 904. It's now Suite 904. She lived there for the last 15 years of her life. Actually died there at the age of 91 of pneumonia in 1955. And many people believe that she actually haunts the hotel. I do have to say, in that picture, she looks a little ghostly. All right, so Colorado had a big post-war tourism boom in the 1950s, and they decided that they wanted to expand the hotel. An earlier plan that you see here on the left-hand side in the 1920s was to close off the atrium lobby at the 3rd floor and build a 19-story tower right up the center of the building. Thank God for the stock market crash of 1929, because when that happened, they decided to shelve that plan. And before they ever got a chance to do it, I bless whoever said, no, wait, let's build across the street. So they built what we call the Tower Annex across Tremont. It opened in 1959 as the Brown Palace West. Later had other names, the Deborah Inn, the Comfort Inn, it's now the Holiday Inn Express. These two properties, even though they have different names, they share the same staff with the Brown Palace, and the staff goes back and forth through a service tunnel that runs under Tremont, and of course guests and the general public go back and forth on the Sky Bridge that goes over Tremont at the mezzanine level. The Holiday Inn Express, by the way, has not reopened since it closed back in April. All right, fast forward to 2020. The current owners of the Brown Palace decided to take advantage of the closure of the hotel by doing major redecorating of all the meeting rooms on the mezzanine level, the Palace Arms, and the 8th and 9th floors, those floors that used to be the private residential apartments. And some interesting discoveries were made as they took up carpet and tore into walls. Before the Skyline Apartments, in the early years of the hotel, the 245-degree angles of the Brown Palace's right triangle on the 8th floor were 2-story high rooms. One of them was the Grand Ballroom, and the other was the Ladies' Ordinary, a combination ladies' lounge, tea room, and changing room, because all the hotel dining rooms used to be on the 8th floor, as were the kitchens. And if you weren't staying in the hotel and you were coming for dinner, there was actually staff that would help you get into your evening clothes in the Ladies' Ordinary. Anyway, when they ripped up the carpet there up on the 8th floor, they discovered here on the left some of the original flooring from that Ladies' Ordinary. It was in the Italian Renaissance style, like the architecture of the atrium lobby. And probably the biggest surprise, in the Onyx Room, which is the largest room in the hotel. It's the largest meeting room on the mezzanine level. It sits directly above the original grand entrance in the hypotenuse of the triangle. When they ripped the carpet up in that room, they discovered that the entire room was bordered by Knights Templar crosses, as you see here on the right-hand side. And I find that very intriguing, because the building was inaugurated and dedicated. The very first event that they hosted on August 12, 1892 was a sit-down banquet for 300 Knights Templar. And there are people who believe that the spirits of the Knights are still sentineling, guarding the Brown Palace. I like to believe that. I have no reason not to. But I'm so sorry that they covered that up. All right, so in the 12 years that I have been at the Brown Palace, I have seen a lot of change. Probably one of the biggest was in 2015 when we became part of the Marriott Autograph Collection. And I always tell my guests that doesn't mean that we are a Marriott. We're not owned by Marriott, but you can use and redeem Marriott reward points. It was good for hotel business because all this crowd suddenly began to take notice of it, but it really did change who came to the Brown Palace. Rooms became a little less expensive, thus the place became a little less exclusive. But what I have really noticed is that as the years go by, they're trying so hard to take away the uniqueness of the place. This is my opinion only. This is not an official opinion of management or anything. But they're trying to trend it, which I keep telling them that's not what people come to the Brown Palace for. If you want trendy, there's a million hotels in downtown Denver where you can find that. But they're trending it. They're trying to make it like other Marriott properties. For example, during the shutdown. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Brown Palace Club. A great room in the 45-degree angle corner on the mezzanine level, right above the Ship Tavern. And they changed that into a concierge lounge because every Marriott autograph collection has a concierge lounge. And the timing was absolutely awful because, of course, it has a buffet, and who knows when we're going to be using buffets again. So that was one of the changes that's making us a little more Marriott-y, seemingly every day. The other big change was in 2018, we got bought by mega real estate investment corporation out of Texas called Crescent Real Estate LLC, and they brought in a different management company for the first time in more than 30 years. It had been Quorum for 30 years, and they had their own ideas and their own people, and a lot of things changed under them. The other thing that I have noticed is that they keep cutting staff. And of course, that means a little bit of cutting back in the legendary service that the hotel has always been known for. So it's hard for me to see that as well. And of course, the pandemic has really just wreaked havoc on all the hotels in downtown Denver, but Brown Palace, absolutely. In fact, in this last year, we have gone from a 4-star, 4-diamond rated hotel to just 3 stars and 3 diamonds. And as I think Andre and Allison mentioned, that's not fair during the pandemic. And I think they're really right about that. On the plus side, we have a managing director, Nick Moschetti. Bless his heart, he started in February of 2020. Talk about a hard time to begin a new job and when you're getting to know the property. But during the 64 days that the Brown Palace was closed, this man answered every call that came in. And because of that, he now understands, he gets the Brown Palace and what it means to the people of Denver. He knows it's not just a place with layers and layers of history, but with layers and layers of memories. And so he's doing everything he can to kind of retain the uniqueness, to retain, the things that make it so special to the people of Denver. Because I tell folks, it's not just old, it's not just historic and significant. The Brown Palace is beloved, and that's why we all have a special place for it in our hearts. The end. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That was fascinating. It's always so fun to hear you talk so passionately about the hotel. We did have a few questions start to come in over the chat that maybe I will begin to feed to you. And if other folks have questions and you would prefer to unmute yourself and ask, please feel free, or put them in the chat and we will make sure that Deborah gets these all answered. So the first one that I saw come in was just asking if, when you talk about the 8th and 9th floor being apartments, did they have kitchens and those types of amenities?
Mm-hmm. They did. They all had little kitchenettes. These were really wealthy people, and 9 times out of 10, they would eat in the restaurants or get room service. But yeah, you want to make a cup of tea, some soup, whatever, every now and then. So they did all have kitchenettes. But when they became hotel guest rooms again, of course, those were taken out. The one exception is the original presidential suite, which is on the 8th floor in the 90-degree angle corner. We call it the Eisenhower Suite now. That one never, ever had a kitchenette.
Okay, awesome. And then can you talk a little bit about when the apartments closed and when those maybe went back to being rentable hotel rooms?
It was actually very gradual. I'm thinking probably starting in the 1960s. As people moved out, they would turn them back into guest rooms, or sometimes the residents would die. I mentioned the 2 most long-term, Mrs. Blackmer, she died in her apartment. Kenneth Townsend died in his apartment. Mrs. Crawford Hill died in her apartment, and Charles Betcher. So that's why we think those top 2 floors, I don't know if you believe in ghosts or not, but if the Brown Palace does have those, I think those top 2 floors are among the more likely places to find them.
It sounds like it. Lisa was asking if you think that they're going to retain that Knights of Templar crosses in the tile flooring.
It's still there. They just covered it all up. So I hope so. I sure hope so. I hope whoever next tears up the carpet will see that and go, wow, this is cool. We don't want to expose it, but maybe somebody later on will, just like the mosaic tile up on the 8th floor. You know, it's still there, and I'm really glad of that. And who knows how many other, you know, secrets are covered by redecorations and remodels and things, but it's just so exciting when you find those things. We came across pretty recently where there used to be a dumbwaiter. You know, just those sorts of things are really fun to discover.
Yeah, definitely. I know we found some stuff like that in the restoration at the Molly Brown house, for sure. Little secrets hidden in the house.
Yeah.
Tamara was asking if the Brown is still a Marriott property, and I think the answer is it is not, but you can use your points there. Is that correct?
Right, it's Marriott Autograph Collection. So yeah, not owned by Marriott, but we are on their reservation system, and we pretty much follow whatever they tell us to do. That's really bottom line. Yeah.
So maybe closer to Marriott than we thought.
Yeah, it's actually too darn close to Marriott, yes, in my opinion.
I think based on the fact that we're looking at this beautiful picture you have up here, Lisa is asking if the 9th floor is actually higher than the stained glass skylight.
Yes, it's above the stained glass skylight. That skylight is at floor level for the 9th floor. And then above the 9th floor, there's this kind of greenhouse shaped structure. And that's what catches snow, hail, dead birds, anything that might threaten the stained glass skylight. And in the early years of the hotel, that structure was glass. It's now plexiglass, of course, because that's a lot sturdier. But the 9th floor has always been above the stained glass skylight. Mm-hmm.
Very keen observational skills there, Lisa.
Very much, yes.
Viv
had a great can I add one more thing to that? The 9th floor, when you go up there, you suddenly feel a lot taller. And that's because its ceiling is much, much shorter. That floor was never intended to be a public floor at all, because the parts that weren't part of those 2-story rooms in the 45-degree angle corners were just little tiny chambers for servants traveling with families and sample rooms for traveling salesmen. So the ceiling in the 9th floor is much lower than any of the other floors. Little trivia.
Yeah, that's kind of neat. Viv was asking if you know how the relationship between the National Western Stock Show and the Brown Palace kind of evolved.
Yeah, I think we can thank Dan Thornton for that. Dan Thornton was Colorado governor starting in 1950. He was a rancher and a Hereford breeder in Gunnison County before that. And way back in 1945, his 2 Hereford, they were bulls at the time. They're steers now that we exhibit, but they were bulls at the time. TT Regent and TT Regent 2. They were father and son Herefords. One champion and grand champion. And he had such a good relationship with the owners and management of the hotel, and stayed at the hotel every year for the stock show, that they invited him to exhibit them in the lobby. And that tradition continues until this year. All the traditions are falling apart this year, but it is something to see. You know, a grand champion steer right next to the ladies having tea in their hats and gloves, only in Denver.
Oh yeah, it's quite a scene for sure. Hopefully it'll return next year and we can all check it out again.
Yeah.
Sandy had a question about a story about the head housekeeper having an apartment hidden on the top floor. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. Her name was Rosalie Soper, and she started as an executive housekeeper in the 40s. She was there into the 1960s, and she did have a little apartment on the roof. She was on the 10th floor of our 9-story building. She also had a home, but she spent a lot of time in that apartment at the Brown Palace. And that part of that apartment now is our hotel archives. So it's where I get to work. And I can see the back door of her former apartment. She used to have a little patio up there, and she would wait for full moon nights to throw private parties for 20 of her friends. You know, she had little potted trees and lawn furniture, and that must have been so great.
Yeah, I think you might officially have the coolest office I've ever heard of. That's really neat. Alice was asking if President Eisenhower had a heart attack at the Brown.
No, good question. He was in Denver, as we all know, when he had that heart attack, 1955, I believe. But he had just played 3 rounds of golf, like 27 holes of golf. And he had the heart attack and collapsed at his mother-in-law's house on Lafayette Street. That was Mamie's mother's house. And that's where he had the heart attack. So it wasn't at the Brown Palace. And after his heart attack, the Brown Palace's executive chef, Ira Dole, who was also a big fishing buddy of Dwight's when he was in Colorado, completely changed the menu that he prepared for him to make it much more heart healthy.
That sounds like a wise decision.
Yes, very good.
Robert is asking about the stained glass receiving maintenance. Does that happen every year, or when was the last time it took place?
Okay, so the wonderful thing is that the company that created that stained glass skylight, Watkins Glass, still exists with a 4th generation of the same family. And so the current guy, he's like in his 70s. He's worked on the stained glass skylight since he was like 7 years old. It's usually cleaned about every 10 years because it is enclosed. It's enclosed with a glass brick around the sides, and it's got that protective structure on top. So it doesn't really get very dirty or dusty or anything, but about every 10 years, they've done it once in the time that I've been there. There's 2 different ways they do it. Apparently, sometimes they dangle from the protective structure and clean it that way. When I was there, they kind of built a little, planking web across it as they went and cleaned, and that was really fascinating to watch. But it's scary to see people up there from up there, and especially from down below. But nobody's ever fallen through, knocking wood. And in the center of that stained glass skylight is this huge winch for raising and lowering the monster chandelier that we have up at the holidays. So that people do go out there at least once, twice a year to raise and take down that chandelier.
I feel like no historical talk in Denver would be complete without a question about tunnels. Can you tell us if there were any and where they led, if there were any?
Well, there were lots of tunnels in early downtown Denver, and they were coal tunnels between the basement furnaces because that's how everybody, heated their buildings. So I'm sure the one that they're thinking of is one that used to go between the Brown Palace basement and the basement of the Navarre across the street. Because from 1900 clear into the 1930s, that was, an infamous brothel. And they claim that during that period, even though it was intended as a coal tunnel, it had other, dirty purposes. Where people from the Brown could go back and forth without being seen. But honestly, the Navarre was also probably connected to Trinity Methodist. Trinity Methodist was connected to us. Everybody in the neighborhood, they were all connected with these coal tunnels. So sometimes used by people, and that's where that story comes from. That tunnel, by the way, was collapsed and sealed at both ends in the 1950s.
I gotcha. And actually, I'm reading the question more clearly. My apologies. This one was asking if there was one to the Capitol. Do you know if there's a coal tunnel that went to the Capitol?
We've never found any evidence of one, but of all the rumors, that one kind of makes the most sense to me. I've heard people say, oh, I heard there was a tunnel to Union Station. I heard there was a tunnel to the Mint. I'm like, whoa. The Capitol, though, makes sense to me because if you were a wealthy, influential businessman and you wanted to, get some legislators on your side, that would be a pretty neat way to get them to your suite in the Brown Palace and do some little wheeling and dealing. But as I say, we have never found any evidence of a tunnel that goes to the Capitol in our basement. I have been, though, in the basement of the Capitol. I was a tour guide there in the summer of 2000 in you know, the highway patrol or the security people there. And one night after hours, they took us down there, and there's a lot of really weird collapsed entrance tunnels down there that went to who knows where. So I'm not going to rule out the possibility. I just have to say there's no evidence.
Okay, and actually there's a great conversation going back and forth about tunnels in the chat, so feel free to look at that too. There is a question about just a little background on the Ship's Tavern.
Okay, that opened in 1934 to celebrate the end of Prohibition. And the way that it happened was C.K. Betcher took several trips to New England, and he had acquired this huge collection of scale model sailing ships. And if you've seen them, these are not small models. They're like 3-5 feet across. And he had them all in their mansion. And in C.K. Betcher's mansion was what's now our governor's mansion. And Edna didn't really want to have her decorations dominated by sailing ships. And so she suggested, when he was talking about opening this tavern in the hotel, that he do it in a maritime theme or a nautical theme, and it would be the perfect place to display his ship. So thank goodness he went for that idea.
Yeah, it is definitely, it sounds like it's a place that Janice loves to visit, and it's definitely one of the fun pubs in Denver for sure.
It is.
And then I had, oh, sorry, there's one more that just popped in. What year did the Betchers sell the hotel?
1980. 1980, and it was really the Betcher Foundation, you know, that owned it then, and that's when they sold it to Aircoa was the name of the company. And ever since then, it's been in mega real estate investment companies' hands. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. And then I had asked, and it's okay if you weren't able to find an answer, but just about like, did we see anything in terms of like extended stays during COVID? Like did the Brown do anything to try and keep
you know, I never did get an answer from
okay.
the person I asked. So I don't know, although it does say where they talk about their enhanced, you know, housekeeping and cleaning things. They say, we won't be cleaning every day. We'll only come when you request it. But it did say in case of extended stays, we'll come every 6 days. So apparently there are still a few of those. I was talking with you earlier too about a couple of creative things they did here during the pandemic. You know, holiday tea is like monster popular there, and they couldn't do it this year because it was red alert and there was no indoor dining. So somebody came up with a very clever idea to do afternoon tea in a box to go. So they would have the scones and the sweets, and they even had a little tape or a CD or something of our pianist John Kite playing holiday music. So apparently that was really, really very popular. And then the package I was reading for New Year's Eve, again, there was no dining in any of our dining venues, so they suggested that you come and have your 4-course meal in your room and leave your door open to hear John Kite and his trio playing in the atrium. So they had to really stretch to try and make things work, but they were pretty creative about it.
Yeah, it sounds like some creative solutions to a very unprecedented time. There were 2 more questions that came in. One was asking about the wrought iron panels in the lobby.
The wrought iron what?
Just the wrought iron.
Oh, the panels.
Aren't there
okay.
a couple that are upside down?
Yeah. That is true, and nobody really knows why. We have a couple of theories. The one that we usually tell on tours is that it's in line with various artistic traditions around the world, quilting, Navajo weaving, etc., where they consider it sacrilegious to try to create something perfect. So you put an intentional flaw in every work of art. So those 2 panels maybe are intentional flaws. However, that doesn't explain why they are where they are. So I'll tell you a little weird thing. You can give it what you will. But a few years ago when we were celebrating our 125th ideas about what we could do special. And one of our engineers said, let's get students from the CU Denver Civil Engineering to come do the measurements and determine which step on our grand staircase is exactly 1 mile high, 5,280 feet. And before they did any measurements, knowing the weird secret traditions of Freemasons and Knights Templar and their connections to the hotel, I said, wouldn't it be amazing if the center point of a line connecting our two upside down panels was exactly 1 mile high? And when they did the measurements, that turned out to absolutely be the case. Coincidence? Maybe.
Wow.
As I say, make of it what you will.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
It gave me goosebumps.
Yeah, for sure. Juliana had a great question about impacts from the Spanish flu to operations. Do you know anything about that?
From the what operations?
The Spanish flu in 1918, did that have an impact to operations?
Oh, that's a really good question, because I've never really seen a thing about it in our archives, and yet it must have had some impact.
Yeah, it
that
sounds
is
like
a wonderful question. Next time I get back in the archives, I'll dig into that. After I have my vaccinations.
Right.
Sorry, yeah, I really don't know anything about that.
Yeah, it sounds like they probably didn't completely halt operations.
No, they didn't, which is why so many people got sick.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very interesting. Any other I think I've gotten to everybody's. Do you know when tea started in the lobby? That was one that
In the lobby? Yes, 1985.
Oh,
So
okay.
they've always served tea somewhere or other around the hotel. They used to serve it in the Onyx Room. They used to serve it in the ladies' ordinary. They used to serve it in the lounge, which was where the Ship Tavern is before the Ship Tavern. But it's only been in the atrium lobby since 1985.
That's really interesting. And then just a follow-up from your panel question, in case somebody wants to go, what floor are the upside down panels on?
Okay, well, one is on the 4th floor and one's on the 5th.
Okay.
Yeah,
Alrighty.
and they're on opposite sides of the atrium lobby.
Okay. All right.
Okay. And pretty much anyone who works there can point them out to you.
Oh yeah, that's good to know too. Yeah. That'll help Kim out. She'll find them a lot easier that way. And Elise is asking, are tours available for people?
They haven't had any since March. I'm hoping, as things improve, as I get vaccinated, all of that good stuff, those will come back. But there are not any currently.
Yeah. And then Leah is asking about integration. Do you know when it finally integrated?
I think they finally had to start a little bit in the 60s, with all the civil rights and all of that. They were also, besides being, racially biased, they were really gender biased. I mean, women were welcome from the beginning, but they had their very special places, the ladies' lounge, the ladies' ordinary, whatever. They weren't supposed to go just anywhere they wanted in the hotel. And just recently, the Brown Palace has hired a female executive chef. And they asked me if she was the first executive chef of the Brown Palace female. And I said, absolutely. They didn't have executive female anything until the late 1980s. So yeah, they dragged their feet on that stuff big time. But yeah, I'm sure with the civil rights and all of that in the 60s, they had to begin loosening up on that.
I gotcha. Okay, hopefully that is a good answer for you, Leah. And then Robert was asking about the photo again. Is the lobby furniture shown here historic or reproductions from the time?
That is reproductions from the time. Yes, that's pretty recent picture.
Okay, so we're looking at pretty much what it looks like today.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Luckily, they haven't messed with the lobby.
Oh yeah. Hopefully it'll kind of stay the same. Yes. Tamara's asking, do you think it was the Betchers who instituted racial inequality?
It was before them. It was really from the very beginning. Yeah. I'm not positive about this, but I'm going to go right around 1912. The Brown Palace did welcome not Dubois, who was the other? Booker T. Washington. They actually let him stay there. And there was a big story in the newspaper at the time. And the managing director made a point, we're making an exception in his case because he is superior to most of his race. Ouch.
Yeah.
So it went way back. Yeah.
Boy, yeah, that doesn't sound nice, especially with our 21 years. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions.
Thank you for asking them.
Yeah, it's so fun just to like continue to peel back the layers and find more about it. I am going to ask you to stop your share because I did want to just talk about a couple other historic, they're all historic, hotels in Denver, because this is one version of a housing model where we do see this bit of a pivot at the start of the Great Depression to try and do something a little bit different from what had been happening before. Oh, sorry, guys. But the Brown it's a unique example because there is that part of the Brown history that is luxury and that is class. And it's a little bit different than really talking about hotels as housing models. But we do have some interesting historic models of hotels that have, served as housing at the time that they were built and then still serve housing, but in a slightly different fashion. I selected these three because of the diversity and their range. They represent, there are a lot of models that I could have chosen. But I thought these were kind of interesting. So the photo that we're all looking at right now is actually down the street from the Brown Palace. It's 1514 17th Street, and you're looking at the Barth Hotel. It was built in 1882. So it was actually kind of interesting because it was originally, it was built as a liquor warehouse, but that changed pretty quickly thereafter. By the late 1880s, it was operating at a hotel, and it operated as a hotel until the 1980s. So for a while, it was able to claim the moniker of the longest continually operating hotel in Denver, which now is going to just kind of jump around a whole lot more after this year. It started to be called the Barth, as we call it today, in the 30s. After having a number of different iterations. But the interesting piece is when it stopped being a hotel in 1980, it sold to an organization that today goes by Senior Housing Options. This will shock us knowing Denver real estate today, for $600,000. And it underwent a number of renovations, but it was redesigned to house senior residents. And today it still houses 62 residents. So it's kind of interesting. The hotel would have housed 100 people. So to fit a little bit and allow people to have a little bit more space, as we're used to today, that's why we see that little bit of a slip in numbers. But it's a really interesting model. I mean, in the 1980s, when the downtown that we think of today really didn't exist. There's been so much change in that neighborhood over time, but it has remained an affordable option for people that need it in the neighborhood. So that was one that I just thought kind of added an interesting, at the time, in the late 1880s when it became a hotel, it wouldn't have been kind of the luxurious option of the Brown. It would have been a much more kind of economical hotel as we would think of it. The other one that's kind of interesting is this, the First Avenue Hotel. So we've jumped in Denver. We're now at 49 West First Avenue. This one was built in 1907, and it was built as a single room occupancy hotel. And so this is a concept that I don't think we kind of think about as much anymore, but basically the idea was that you didn't rent a flat, you didn't rent an apartment with like a kitchen and a bathroom, you rented a room. And they're often very small, like 80 to 140 square feet. And they were often modestly furnished. So you'd have like a bed, a chair, a desk, and that's it. And then all the additional accommodations you might need, like a kitchen, a bathroom, those were all shared amenities. And so by its nature, it was very economical. So in 1907, this would have been a really easy place if you didn't have a whole lot to be housed very easily and very quickly. And so it's just kind of interesting to think about, this is in so many respects, a vanishing form of housing. So between 1955 and 2013, it's estimated that 1 million single room occupancy like dwelling units just vanished in the US. And that's a combination of things that are happening. Some regulations changed that made it a little bit harder to have that kind of housing model. We also see gentrification leading to conversions of them into other uses. And then demolition is also another factor that led to that. But the interesting thing about this one today is that it's kind of been rebranded as the Quail. That's actually the name of the gentleman who built it initially. And it is being used for affordable housing. So there's an income cap for people to live here. And so you have to make at least 60% under the median average income in Denver. So this is one where they're trying to kind of retain that ethos of affordability in a building like this, but in a way that's a bit more 2021. And then the third one that I thought was interesting, and again, kind of along the same lines of what we're talking about, hotels becoming options for housing, is this one. It's called Circa West Condominiums, but it was actually built as the Four Winds Motel in 1962. And it is on Colfax. It's right off Colfax, so its actual address is 1495 Vrain, but it would have been part of the accommodations that line Colfax for people that were vacationing and using Colfax as that main thoroughfare to the mountains. They took the motel and they've actually changed it into condominiums, as you can see on the side there, but they did make a commitment to affordability on this one as well. So they are keeping the pricing and the cost of this unit much lower so that housing can be something that isn't completely out of reach for people. So I thought these were kind of like three interesting examples of ways that hotels perhaps can either be, and in this case, these were purposely changed. Sometimes it happens more organically. We find that hotels and motels are being used for extended stay residents in no way that is formalized. So it's filling a gap in housing for people that are going through maybe temporary displacement, a displacement due to a catastrophic event. And so we see these kind of popping up all over. And I'm gonna stop the share just for a second. Hopefully you got enough of a look at the pieces there. But I did notice that a couple of you guys are asking questions, and so I wanna make sure that I've got this. Okay, so you guys are talking about other examples that you've seen of hotels turning into housing options for people. The other piece that kind of made me think of, and maybe it's leading you kind of down the same kind of thought, is that, you know, we often, when we talk about individuals experiencing homelessness, we have like a really stereotypical picture in our mind. Maybe it's a gentleman, maybe he's older, maybe he's a little bit grizzled, and he has spent a lot of his life at experiencing homelessness. And that's just one of 4 definitions that the Colorado Coalition for the Homelessness gives us. And while that one is considered chronic homelessness, we do see it a lot throughout Denver. There are a lot of other forms that aren't as visible and are probably utilizing some of these housing models a little bit more frequently. So we consider episodic homelessness if you've had 3 episodes within a year. So it's not that you're fully unhoused, but that you're having moments throughout the year where you're finding that you are unhoused. Transitional, and this one really kind of, I think, spoke to us a little bit tonight, because it's often it happens due to a major event or a catastrophic moment. And I don't know if we need to sum up 2020 as a catastrophic event, but that's definitely what it made me think of. And so this kind of idea that this isn't a permanent, you know, this isn't how you are living permanently, but it is something that could very easily happen to you. And then they also have a 4th category that, again, is very interesting. And these are hidden what they consider hidden homelessness. So this is without a permanent residence for a period of time. And that could mean you're staying with your sister, or you're crashing on a couch, or you're in a hotel or a motel. And these are really difficult to count. And so one thing that's coming up really quick at the end of January is like one of the ways that Denver assesses the number of people experiencing homelessness is they do a point in time count. So they go out and they count everybody who they can. Some of these, the three other options, if you're transitional or hidden or episodic, you may actually not be captured in that. And that actually, they're a little bit harder sometimes to get services and resources to. So I did just kind of want to point out that, you know, we see the brown, it's very luxurious, but it did, when there was an economic depression, it changed the way it did business. And here are a couple of additional options, examples of that happening. So I'm happy to answer questions about that if that kind of spurred anyone to think about anything in a new or a different way. We'll give folks just a second if you want to pop anything in the chat that kind of relates to that. So, and this is something, so Tara's sharing that this has been something that has been happening with her for the past 3 years. And I think when, you know, when we think about it, like with these definitions, it hits so much closer to home. We all realize that, you know, the fact that there's a roof over our heads is such a luxury, and that it could happen really quickly, that something could happen in your life that would make a really big change. So I'm really sorry to hear that, Tara. I hope that things are getting back on your feet here. Oh, that's so wonderful that you're in a safe space. Robert is asking a question that actually Andrea did a bit of looking into about the East Area Plan and East Colfax and how that kind of fits into this whole conversation.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Thank you for talking about that, Robert. So what we like to do then at our salon series, and what we hope to do with this Empowered by Place event over this year, is really then connect these historic places and these historic stories of Denver to some of the headlines that we're maybe seeing in the newspaper or online today. So you may have seen a couple days ago that the Denver City Council extended its deadline for contracting with local hotels to house people during COVID-19. So early on in the pandemic, Denver worked with several partners to come up with some of these creative sheltering solutions. So on Monday, they extended their contract to allow for temporary housing in hotel rooms for people experiencing homelessness during the COVID crisis. So they voted to extend the contract an additional 4 months. That would allow them to secure 150 rooms to use as shelter during this time. One of those people responsible for that is actually the Chief Housing Officer in the Department of Housing Stability in Denver. Their nickname is Host, and that's headed by Britta Fisher. So she's worked to provide financial coaching in the past to an organization called Empowered. Governor Hickenlooper appointed her to the Colorado Housing Board, and she was elected chair of that board in 2017. She also serves on the Housing Colorado Legislative Committee, and she's a member of the Mothers Advocating for Affordable Housing. So she has a sense of what's happening housing-wise here in Denver. So they actually have created an annual housing plan that you can access online. I'm going to share screen real quick. So here's that headline where Denver extends the contracts to continue housing homeless in hotels during COVID. So really housing or hotels becoming a pivotal part of the housing solution as we continue through this pandemic. And we'll again include these links in an email. They're in the chat already. So if you go to denver.gov, you can see that they were able to secure 810 hotel and motel rooms to expand the capacity to serve those at most risk of contracting and those who are recovering from COVID. We also heard stories about the convention center, the stock show buildings all being used to help house, but hotels certainly became a part of that mix that they were using. So you can actually go and read this entire action plan at the host website of the Housing Stability Department. So that's a way you can get to know what's happening in Denver right now and how hotels play a part in that. And then just as Robert mentioned, hotels play into the East Area Plan, which was just adopted. It's a lengthy document, but I think it's interesting to read through and see how all these different things come together. And certainly East Colfax Avenue hotels and the one on West Colfax that Allison talked about, they all sort of play in together. And you can see right here in the East Area Plan that under letter D and then subletter E, that transitioning motels along Colfax Avenue into permanent housing for those most vulnerable. And the East Area Plan really identified hotels as an option for transitional housing, as well as a current problem in housing in Denver with homeless people using hotels and neighborhoods sort of seeing that as a problem, but how can they be turned into a positive by being used as purposeful transitional housing during different times in the city. So the East Area Plan is a good resource for understanding how hotels, especially those along Colfax Avenue and many of them mid-century or Gucci style architecture and things like that, how they become a mix and where Denver hopes to go in working with housing issues here in the city. So we have all of that up. So the East Area Plan is a great way to see how that becomes a part of it. And then of course there's the suburbs. The suburbs don't necessarily have the housing resources that Denver has. So there's actually a group of women that this article tells us about who have banded together and worked to find housing solutions in Denver's southern suburbs. So cities like Littleton, Centennial, and how they can use hotel rooms as a way to address some of the housing issues that they're facing there. They are a group called SAFER, which is Solutions for Achieving Fast, Effective Response. They're mostly social workers, nonprofit Alliance Network members. They work for mental health organizations. So they see these chronic issues that are putting people on the street and say they see hotels as a way to add into the mix, a way to get people off the street and also get them connected to coordinated social services who come to the hotel parking lots and work with the people there to get them the services that they need. For instance, Jefferson County did one of its count of homelessness people and found 997 people living on the street just in Jefferson County. So it really allowed them to get an idea that there's more people living on the street than they have sort of regular housing for at that time. And it was more than double that their point count, which Allison mentioned a minute ago. So that point of time count, which is a count of sheltered and unsheltered people experiencing homelessness, is required by housing and urban development. And it's a nationwide count that has to happen. So municipalities, counties, states have to be able to record those. So as Allison said, the count is coming up here in Denver. They are required to count sheltered people every year and then unsheltered counts every other year. 2021 is a year for unsheltered counts, and there are some concerns about how those will be conducted given the pandemic at this time. So you can see in this article that Donna Bryson is the author on this article. She has been a freelance reporter for Denverite the last couple of years, covering housing and hunger issues. She also wrote a book called Home in the Brave, which covers grassroots efforts in Montrose to help military veterans reintegrate into civilian life. She also wrote It's a Black-White Thing about race issues in South Africa. So she has been writing often about these housing issues here in Denver. This summer in particular, she wrote an article about a family who had newly relocated from Arizona, and they were struggling to find housing in Denver. So she was able to report on the various options available from the city, the Salvation Army, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. And I think her article really illustrated how little housing is available for families, where individuals have sometimes an easier time finding temporary shelter than whole families do. So one of the things that she was able to then report on and talk about was that the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless back in October was able to acquire and then finish out a hotel at around Quebec and I-70 that they were able to turn it into 139 micro apartments. They expect it to be fully leased, and I'm sure by now it is fully leased. So people with housing vouchers from the state are allowed to come in, and they pay no more than 30% of their income on rent. And then the coalition provides any of the maintenance and sort of services like that for their units. And on average, their tenants are only paying about $100 a month, with many people who are living there their income coming solely from disability and other type of benefits like that. So this is one mix where the Coalition for the Homeless is using hotels as a way to create additional housing. And then of course we have our neighbors close to us at the Molly Brown House Museum, the Salvation Army. They're another current housing partner. Their 1911 building on the same block of the Molly Brown House Museum was actually partially funded by Mrs. Brown and is part of the St. Mary's Academy. So the Salvation Army today, of course, is helping people experiencing homelessness, including families. So there is a mix out there for families. They have the Lambeth Family Center, but a lot of people who come to the Lambeth Family Center are coming from another place in Denver called the Family Hotel. And as you can see on their website, they served more than 3,400 people in 2017. So it's a fully operational hotel for 40 families in Denver that come through DDHS. And they also create respite rooms for those who are getting discharged out of hospital, but have no place to recuperate. So they work with the respite coordinator and Department of Human Services to get people into the family hotel, and the Salvation Army will work with families to get them into their Lambeth property. So another way that hotels are sort of being used to house families, to house individuals during this time. And they're given vouchers that allow them to stay, for instance, at the family motel for 14 nights. So that's when the Salvation Army sort of kicks in and then finds them a place at the Lambeth or other places like the Colorado Coalition facility up on I-70 or one of their other mix of properties, depending on how they qualify for services. So lots of unique ways that Denver is able to start using hotels to address homelessness here in Denver, and use that in a mix of different varieties that you can see if you read through the East Area Denver plan and things like that. So just some of the issues of homelessness that we've seen this year include things like the constitutionality of Denver's camping ban has been come into question. That was just ran through the Colorado Supreme Court. So that was an issue that we'd also seen in the headlines lately. Those urban camping bans are now considered unconstitutional again. And then of course, voters rejected recently issue 300, which I'm sorry, I didn't have that article pulled up, but 82% of the voters struck down Initiative 300, or the Right to Survive, which would have overturned the camping ban and said it was declared unconstitutional. So, and then just one more thing I wanted to sort of put in your brains as something to think about when we think about the built environment and the areas around us in the city that also are affect homelessness and people who have to live on the streets at the time. And that's something called hostile architecture or hostile landscape. You may have heard of this as sort of a design concept. That is where features implemented into city planning and architecture specifically are put there to deter homeless people from finding somewhere to sleep or rest. So for instance, this bench is slanted, so there's no way for you to sleep on that bench. This bench has these weird little half armrests that really aren't meant for your arms. We have things like rock landscaping so that it's not comfortable to sleep on, spikes, sort of segmented benches again, so you can't lay down, more spikes and things like that. So ways around our city and our built environment as we're walking around, some of those design elements might be intentional as a way to deter homeless people from sort of encamping on those spaces. So, and I know that's been an issue our city has had to address through the summer and into the winter. We actually have 2 encampments now within a couple of blocks of the Molly Run House Museum that seem to be running quite successful at this time, where there are sub-zero weather tents in enclosed parking lot, fenced in spaces with access to sanitation, access to heat and things like that. So a different solution that's not necessarily a hotel, but a different way to think about housing people, especially as we make our way through this pandemic. So I'm going to stop sharing at this time and see if there's any questions before we wrap up. I know we're running out of time here.
There were a couple of questions. It seems like a few of them answered themselves. Jill was asking for the name of an org and Leah found it for her, which is awesome. And I was also going to point out, Andrea did put a bunch of the links she shared in the chat too. So that's another spot if somehow you missed a little detail that you wanted to. And then just some folks sharing about their personal experience, which I'm just so grateful that everybody feels like comfortable to share what they're going through. And it's a really interesting, it's a lot of pieces coming together here, right? So we're kind of addressing it from this as hotels as a possible moment of housing, but I think all of us acknowledge that, you know, we're all closer than we think to finding ourselves in a situation like this, and I think we respect everybody's experience here. The other piece that I was going to mention, this is a really about face, and I apologize, but at the beginning, we intended to do an SCFD poll so that we could tell SCFD what counties folks came from. Andrea's going to launch that now, but feel free to fill that out while thinking and placing things in the chat that helps us just keep kind of having the conversation.
Yeah, I think Robert had said something with undercounting that impacts funding for the homeless, and you're right. I think that's one of the concerns that they're having as the point count is coming up here fast at the end of January, that given COVID, is it safe to have people out counting? Is it safe to sort of, you know, have people gathered together in order to count? Like, so it's just the count itself is problematic for unhoused people this year. And given how many times some of these people have been moved or displaced throughout the summer, fall, and winter. So there are some concerns, just like we have larger concerns maybe nationally about the census and how that affects future government funding. The same thing happens with these point counts. The housed counts happen every year, but the unhoused counts only happen every 2 years. So I think that has a big impact if they're not able to get out and get the unhoused counted like they would like to this year. Thank you.
Andrea, are you able to launch that poll?
Yes, I did. And everyone's filling it out.
Sorry. Okay.
See it
I guess I must be because I'm the host, I can't see it. So I'm like, yeah. Oh, we should do that. Sorry about that. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Just more wonderful reflections coming in. A few thank yous. And we thank you. Like, this was a little bit, as I said in the beginning, a little bit of like mental acrobatics to kind of follow our train of thought. Hopefully it made sense. It made sense to us at the time. Shared Deb's expertise, but then also really try and like talk about what's happening right now in Denver, and our hotel is going to be used as housing. That East area plan that Andrea was talking about is super fascinating. There's a lot of pieces in there that can continue, I think, to impact this for years to come. One thing that it leans a little bit more heavily on is additional dwelling units, and this is always, kind of interest to us from a couple lenses. One is that it is a historic solution. So it was really common to have somebody living in a carriage house or an additional building on your property until zoning laws kind of changed that. And so in a sense, to us as historians, it seems like a natural evolution to encourage ADUs, to allow people to age in place, to allow additional opportunities for people to have, have their property, but then also have other opportunities for places to live or income. Yeah, it's super interesting to think about, and we've had a couple of these coming in the chat. This one is from Ginny, the other one was from Jill about, Jill was pointing out, there's a lot of vacant retail spaces right now. Ginny's saying, oh my gosh, there are all these Offices, like what are we gonna do if people don't go back to work? What's gonna happen there? It is gonna be really interesting to kind of see how the population changes, what this means in the short term and the long term, I think for especially in the sense of built environment, like how do we use these spaces?
Definitely. I'm going to launch one more poll if you guys don't mind. And that would be if you want to throw us your choice for a future Empowered by Place topic. And I think the discussion of retail and office fronts and things like that is a great discussion. And just a reminder, our next Empowered by Place is going to be on Thursday, March 4th at 7 p.m. And we're going to discuss Deborah's legacy businesses in light of the news that El Chapultepec will be closing its doors after 87 years. So are there preservation tools that can be put in place that would maybe have possibly, you know, played a role in El Chapultepec or other legacy businesses, and what are other sort of legacy business models of preservation maybe that exist around the country? So we'll look at that as a topic at our next one, but we'd love to hear from you guys if there's other topics where we can connect the built environment and place and people in Denver's history to the headlines that we see around us. So, of course, monuments was the top choice, and we've had a lot of discussion, especially over the last year in Denver and around our nation the last couple of years, about monuments, most related to Civil War coming down. The second topic, 9th Street Auraria, is really looking at historic 9th Street and the neighborhood itself of Auraria as the earliest neighborhood in Denver, and what some of the issues are around that neighborhood. We thought we could look at historic movie venues in Denver. We all love going to see movies at the Mayan. Hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be able to do that. I saw Dr. Fauci announced that he thought maybe by the fall or winter of 2021 that we would be back in live performance theaters and maybe even movie theaters. But what do we have here in Denver for historic movie theaters, or what might be left by the end of 2021? And then we always love to look at 5 Points Cultural District. We in particular love the Black American West Museum, and especially this year with Dr. Justina Ford celebrating her 150th birthday, a monumental year for the Black America West. We always like to look at women in the press and the state of the media. We're just one block away from the Denver Women's Press Club. And then with us being on the same block as what was St. Mary's Academy and is now Salvation Army headquarters for now, there's a word on the street that they are actually relocating. Looking at the Sisters of Loretto, looking at Loretto Heights, and looking at sort of the built environment from the lens of Catholic schooling in Denver. And then I thought a fun topic at some point might be looking at Denver through the lens of the municipal facts books that were published in the 19-teens in Denver. It's a great way to sort of explore Denver and get a daily slice of life that is similar to sort of, I think, how we would look at our Facebook feed every day. So just fun ways to sort of explore Denver's history, but also connect it to how we sort of understand the world today as well. So thank you everyone for filling out that poll. That'll help Allison and I a lot as we move forward and planning the rest of the events for this year. So I'm going to take a quick picture because make sure I save all that.
And in the chat, I don't know if you noticed, Andrea, but somebody put drive-ins.
Ooh, that's a good idea too.
Like,
are there any left anymore? Does anyone know of? I think
there were 2 this summer, and honestly, with COVID, it seemed like such an elegant solution. Yeah. I was like, oh yeah, that's safe. I stay in my car and I watch a movie. But yeah, we might have to do some searching to see if there's 1 or 2 we could talk about in the future.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. We're like 3 minutes over our time, so don't feel like you have to stay, but otherwise I think Allison and I can stay a couple minutes and you can unmute and we can chat or continue to ask questions. So we're here for a few more minutes. Thank you everyone, and we hope to see you at the next one. And check out historicdenver.org for upcoming registration or become a member and see what we're up to with the 50 actions for 50 places.